Greetings, warriors of history. Have you ever wondered what it truly takes to rise from the chaos of feudal Japan and seize power? Picture this: you stand on the edge of a battlefield surrounded by the deafening roar of warriors, the clash of steel and the weight of destiny pressing down on you. Every swing of your sword, every command you give could mean the difference between life and death, not just for you, but for an entire nation. The stakes are impossibly high, and the world you live in is one where loyalty is as fragile as the edge of your blade, and survival is a gamble with no guarantees. In this unforgiving landscape, where ambition runs as deep as the rivers of blood spilled, the question isn't just about winning. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to claim power. How far would you go to secure your place in history? As we journey through one of Japan's most decisive battles, I want you to think about the choices you'd make if you were standing in the shoes of a samurai. Would you remain loyal to your lord, or would you choose survival at any cost? What would you risk, and what would you betray? Let's take this journey together and explore the brutal realities of war and the brutal price of ambition. We're eager to hear your thoughts. How would you navigate this world of power and violence? Drop your comments below and share your strategy for survival in the unforgiving world of feudal Japan. In the 16th century, Japan was a land consumed by constant warfare, where honor was often fought for with blood, and the line between loyalty and betrayal was razor thin. Samurai, once revered as noble warriors, had become the instruments of brutal power struggles, each one vying for dominance in a fractured nation. At the heart of this chaos stood a young warlord, Oda Nobunaga. With his fierce ambition and unyielding desire for power, he was determined to reshape Japan, no matter the cost. It was in the midst of this turmoil that Nobunaga would face his greatest test, the Battle of Okehazama. A battle that would not only determine the fate of his enemies, but also his place in the annals of history. With an army far smaller and weaker than his rival Imagawa Yoshimoto, Nobunaga's courage and strategic brilliance would defy all odds. The clash at Okehazama was more than just a fight. It was a crucible that would forge a warlord's destiny and reveal the true cost of ambition. But what if this one battle, this single moment in time, could change the course of an entire nation? What if the course of history itself hinged on the decisions made in the heat of battle, the price of power, the treachery of loyalty, and the blood spilled in the name of glory? This is the story of the Battle of Okehazama. And as we step into the chaos of that fateful day, we ask, what would you do, standing on the edge of history, knowing that one decision could either bring you victory or destroy everything you fought for? If you're as fascinated by history as we are, and you love diving into the epic battles that changed the world, then this is just the beginning. We've got countless more stories of warriors, leaders, and the dramatic turning points that shape the course of nations. So, if you're enjoying the journey through these incredible moments in history, don't forget to hit that like button, sharing this video with your friends, or anyone you know who's passionate about history is the best way to spread these powerful tales of courage, betrayal, and ambition. But that's not all. If you want to make sure you never miss out on our next adventure through time, subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll join a community of like-minded history buffs who share your thirst for stories that transcend time and give us a deeper understanding of our past. Your support means everything. It allows us to continue bringing these fascinating historical events to life and gives us the motivation to create even more in-depth content. Together, we'll uncover the untold stories of our history from the battlefield to the palace. So, what are you waiting for? Hit that like, share it far and wide, and subscribe to keep following us on this journey through the most intense and transformative moments in history. History deserves to be remembered, and with your help, we'll make sure it is. But this wasn't just any battle. Oda Nobunaga, a young warlord with an unshakable will, found himself on the brink of annihilation. Facing off against Imagawa Yoshimoto's overwhelming forces, Nobunaga's army was vastly outnumbered with just a fraction of the enemy's strength. On the surface, it seemed like an impossible situation. No one would have bet on Nobunaga's survival. Yet in the face of almost certain defeat, he saw an opportunity that no one else could. With extraordinary audacity and an unmatched understanding of strategy, Nobunaga devised a plan so bold and daring it could either bring him glory or destroy him completely. In what became one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in Japanese history, Nobunaga turned the tide of the battle using surprise speed and psychological warfare to strike when his enemies least expected it. But how did he do it? What was the strategy that allowed him to defeat an army so much larger than his own? And what risks did he take in doing so? It wasn't just about fighting. It was about outsmarting and outmaneuvering the enemy in ways no one thought possible. Nobunaga's victory at Okehazama didn't just change the fate of one battle. It changed the course of Japan's history, setting in motion events that would lead to the rise of one of the most powerful warlords the country had ever seen. Stay tuned, because the story behind Nobunaga's victory is one of the most thrilling strategic and high-stakes moments in Japanese history. You won't want to miss the twists and turns that made this battle a true turning point in the Sengoku period. Keep watching to find out how Nobunaga defied the odds and reshaped the future of Japan. The winds of war were shifting across Japan, and the land of Owari was no exception. Oda Nobunaga stood in the war room, his eyes fixed on the map before him. His fingers traced the movements of Imagawa Yoshimoto's vast army marching steadily toward Owari. It was a terrifying sight. Imagawa's forces were said to be twice as large as his own. The odds were overwhelmingly stacked against him. Yet Nobunaga remained calm, his mind already at work on the impossible task ahead. "I won't let him take our land without a fight," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The tension in the room was palpable as the generals gathered around him, their faces filled with uncertainty. The air was thick with the question they all dared not ask aloud: how could they possibly stand up to such a formidable force? One of the generals, his brow furrowed, finally spoke, breaking the silence. "My lord, Imagawa's army is massive. It is said that they are well-trained and well-supplied. Even if we fought with everything we had, there's no chance we could defeat them head-on. We are too few." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The enemy was far too powerful, and their numbers too great. For a moment, it seemed as if all hope was lost. But Nobunaga's gaze did not waver. He slowly rose from his seat and stepped closer to the map, his mind already racing. "Then we don't fight them head-on," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We fight them differently. We strike when they least expect it." The generals exchanged confused looks. Nobunaga had always been unorthodox, but this was a gamble none of them were certain they could afford. "We don't have the numbers to face them in the open," one of the commanders said, uncertainty creeping into his tone. "What do you propose, my lord?" Nobunaga's eyes gleamed with determination as he looked over his plan. "We'll march out at night through the forests and hills. They won't even know we're coming. We'll strike them in their rear where they least expect it." The room fell silent. Striking at the rear of a much larger army was a dangerous, almost suicidal move. But Nobunaga had always believed in one thing: unpredictability. And with unpredictability came opportunity. A murmur of skepticism ran through the room. "And if they catch us off guard before we can reach them?" one general asked. Nobunaga turned to him, his face unreadable. "Then we fight until the last man. But we don't wait for death. We make our move before they know what hit them." The generals hesitated, their minds struggling to accept such a bold, uncertain plan. But Nobunaga was resolute, his eyes burning with a fire that few could challenge. Finally, one of the older generals, a man who had served Nobunaga for years, spoke. "My lord, if we fail, it will be our end," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his words. "But if we succeed, we will rewrite history." Nobunaga nodded, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Exactly. And we won't fail. Not if we fight with everything we have." Outside, the sound of soldiers preparing echoed through the castle. Nobunaga knew that his plan was dangerous, but it was the only chance they had. They couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. Later that night, as the moon hung low in the sky, the soldiers of Oda Nobunaga's army began their stealthy march through the hills, leaving the safety of their fortress behind. The ground beneath their feet was soft, the air filled with the sounds of distant crickets. Every step they took brought them closer to Imagawa's unsuspecting forces and closer to a confrontation that could change the course of history. Meanwhile, in the camp of the Imagawa army, their leader sat comfortably confident in his victory. "There's no way they'll dare to engage us directly," he thought, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. His men were relaxed, preparing for what they thought would be an easy march to conquer Owari. They never saw the Oda forces coming. In the darkness, the samurai of Oda Nobunaga crept forward, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Each man knew the stakes, each one willing to risk everything. For Nobunaga had shown them something far more valuable than courage. He had shown them the power of a well-executed plan, one that could defy the impossible. As dawn approached, the two armies stood on the brink of confrontation. The first whispers of battle were in the air, but no one could have predicted how this day would end. Nobunaga's daring strategy had begun, and the fate of Owari would be decided not by the strength of their numbers, but by the strength of their resolve. Imagawa's forces were much larger, and the outcome seemed inevitable. The news had spread quickly through Oda Nobunaga's camp. Imagawa Yoshimoto's army, over 25,000 strong, was marching toward them, poised to overwhelm the much smaller force of Nobunaga, which barely numbered 3,000 men. In the eyes of most, this was not a battle, but a slaughter waiting to happen. Nobunaga stood alone at the edge of his camp, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The weight of the situation hung heavily over him. The sound of armor clinking, the quiet murmurs of his men as they readied themselves for the worst. It all felt like the calm before an inevitable storm. Even his closest generals were unsure. "We cannot win this fight, my lord," one of his generals, a seasoned veteran, said quietly as he approached. "The enemy outnumbers us by more than 10 to 1. It would be suicide to face them head on." Nobunaga turned his head, his expression unreadable. "I know," he replied simply, "but we will not stand by and wait for defeat. We will fight on our terms, not theirs." The general's face twisted with doubt. "How do you plan to defeat such overwhelming odds? What is the plan?" For a moment, Nobunaga said nothing. He stared ahead, calculating his mind, sharp as a blade. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "We won't fight them head on. We'll make them come to us. We'll strike first before they expect it, but we'll strike where they're most vulnerable, where they think they're safest. We'll hit them in their rear at the least expected moment. When their guards are down, that's when we'll hit." The general's brow furrowed, clearly unconvinced. "At their rear? With what forces? How will we get past their front lines, their vanguard?" Nobunaga's eyes flashed with a fire that the general had seen many times before, the fire of a man who was willing to risk everything. "We use their confidence against them. We'll appear weaker than we are. We'll feign retreat, draw their forces forward, and then we'll hit them where they least expect it. They'll be too focused on the front. Their rear will be exposed." A long silence followed. It was a gamble, a dangerous one. It was the kind of plan that, if it succeeded, would be remembered for generations. If it failed, it would mean certain death for them all. "Are you certain this will work?" the general finally asked, his voice low and hesitant. Nobunaga's lips curled into a grim smile. "No, but we have no other choice. We either act with audacity or we perish. If we wait for them to come to us, we're already dead." The general nodded reluctantly, his gaze lingering on Nobunaga. He had always known that his lord was a man of daring, but now the true extent of that audacity had become clear. It was not just a matter of war tactics, it was a philosophy, a belief that fortune favored the bold. As Nobunaga prepared his forces, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Every soldier, from the highest-ranking officer to the lowest foot soldier, knew that the odds were against them. Yet there was something about Nobunaga's unwavering confidence that kept them from turning back. They had followed him into countless skirmishes and smaller battles, and in each one he had led them to victory against the odds. There was a sense of loyalty, now born not just of duty, but of belief in their leader's vision. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forces of Oda Nobunaga began their march. They moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the night, as if they were ghosts slipping past the enemy. There was no grand speech, no rallying cry. Nobunaga had made it clear there would be no glory in this battle unless they won. The only thing that mattered was survival and the hope that their daring gamble would pay off. But even as they moved, doubts lingered in the back of their minds. Could they really pull off such a bold maneuver? Would Imagawa's forces truly underestimate them? And what would happen if they failed? The night was cold, the air crisp, and the tension almost unbearable. As Nobunaga and his men crept closer to Imagawa's camp, the battle lines of history were being drawn, and the storm of war was ready to break. Would the Oda clan rise to greatness, or would they be crushed under the weight of their own ambition? Only time would tell. As the moonlight filtered through the dense trees, casting long shadows across the battlefield, the protagonist found himself alone at the edge of the camp, his sword resting loosely in his hand. The weight of it seemed heavier than usual, as if it bore the weight of all the uncertainty and fear building up inside him. His mind raced the sounds of the camp bustling around him, but he was lost in his thoughts. Tomorrow, they would march into battle against a force far greater than their own, led by one of the most powerful warlords in Japan. The odds were stacked against them, and the outcome seemed inevitable. Yet there was no turning back now. He could hear the voices of his comrades in the distance, sharpening their weapons, making final preparations. But for a moment, everything felt distant, like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss. His heart raced as he thought of the battle that awaited them, the fear, the chaos, the bloodshed. A part of him wanted to run, to flee this nightmare, and find peace in the quiet of the hills away from the madness. But he knew that running was not an option. Duty bound him here. He clenched his fists, the leather of his gloves creaking. His father had been a warrior, a man who had lived by the sword and died by it. He had always taught him that honor and duty came before all else. To fight for his lord, to protect his people, these were the ideals that had shaped him. And yet, as he stood there, looking at the moonlit horizon, those ideals felt hollow. What was the true meaning of honor if it led to this bloodshed, death, and destruction? Was this what his father had fought for? Was this what it meant to be a samurai? War is inevitable, he thought bitterly, but does it have to be this brutal? A voice broke through his reverie, and he turned to see one of his fellow soldiers, a young man no older than himself approaching. "Are you all right?" the young man asked, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. The protagonist forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking," he replied softly, "thinking about tomorrow." The young man asked, his voice trembling, I'm scared. I've never faced anything like this before. We're outnumbered. How can we possibly win?" The protagonist's mind raced as he looked at the young man, seeing in his eyes the same fear he had felt moments ago. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've fought in battles before, but this is different. We're up against a force we can't defeat, but we have no choice. Our Lord commands us to fight, and we must obey." The young soldier nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. "But what if we don't survive? What if we fail?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, the protagonist was silent. He had thought about this too, the fear that tomorrow might be his last day, the fear of falling in battle without anyone knowing his name, the thought of leaving everything unfinished, of leaving his family, his home, his dreams was unbearable. But there was one thing that steadied him. "We fight because we must." The protagonist finally said, his voice firmer than he felt. "Because if we don't, everything we've worked for, everything our fathers fought for, will be lost. We fight to protect what we love, even if it costs us our lives." The young soldier's eyes searched his face, as if trying to find comfort in his words. "But what if it's all for nothing? What if all this bloodshed is in vain?" The protagonist swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. What if it was all in vain? What if they were just pawns in a game of power, manipulated by those who cared nothing for them? It was a thought he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. "I don't know," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I don't know if it's worth it." But I do know this: if we don't fight, we'll lose everything. Our homes, our families, our way of life. And that, my friend, is something I can't let happen." The young man nodded slowly, though the fear in his eyes remained. "I see. We fight because we must. For our families, for our people." The protagonist clapped him gently on the shoulder. "We fight because, in the end, that's all we can do." As the two men stood there, the sound of the soldiers in the distance grew louder, their preparations for war drawing near. The protagonist could feel his own fear tightening in his chest, his mind still torn between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the grim reality of what awaited them. The battle was inevitable. They would fight, and they would either emerge victorious or die trying. As he looked toward the horizon once more, a cold shiver ran down his spine. This was the price of honor. This was the price of duty. And yet, somewhere deep within him, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow might be the last day he would ever see the world as it was. With a final glance at his comrade, the protagonist turned and walked toward the camp, his sword at his side, his heart heavy with uncertainty. But one thing was clear: he would face whatever came for duty, for honor, and for the chance to survive. As the first light of dawn broke over the hills, Oda Nobunaga's army moved in near silence. Their steps muffled by the dense forest that shielded them from the eyes of Imagawa's advancing forces. The night had been spent in restless preparation, and now, with the sun barely rising, the samurai of Oda were ready to embark on the dangerous march that would decide their fate. Nobunaga, with a calm that belied the gravity of the situation, stood at the front of his army, his eyes scanning the horizon. The air was thick with tension, and the warriors around him were quiet, their thoughts as heavy as the armor they wore. Nobunaga had given them a single order: to move swiftly, silently, and without question. They would avoid detection at all costs. If Imagawa's army learned of their movement, their surprise attack would be lost, and with it, any hope of victory. In the camp behind him, his generals were organizing the troops, each one knowing the risks they faced. They had only one chance: no second strikes, no room for error. If they failed, they would be crushed. If they succeeded, however, Nobunaga would secure his place in history. "Move quickly, but silently," Nobunaga had told them. "The moment we are seen, the battle is lost." The sound of clanking armor was muted as the soldiers adjusted their gear, checking their weapons, and securing their packs. Every movement was calculated, designed to make as little noise as possible. For all the years spent training, for all the battles fought, this moment felt different. This battle was not just about skill. It was about outsmarting an enemy far stronger than them. As they moved through the forest, the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the path ahead. The troops moved in tight formations, their faces set with determination, eyes scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of Imagawa's scouts. The forests of Owari were thick with foliage, and though it was an advantage for concealment, it was also an obstacle. Every step had to be calculated. One misstep could lead to disaster. Mitsuhide Akechi, Nobunaga's trusted advisor, rode alongside him. His expression was grave, his eyes sharp, as he kept watch for any signs of the enemy. "My lord, we move closer to Imagawa's camp." Mitsuhide said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. We should be careful. If they detect us, they won't. Nobunaga interrupted, his voice steady and confident. They're too sure of themselves. Imagawa's army is too large to be worried about a small force like ours. We will use that arrogance against them. Mitsuhide nodded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. Still, we must be cautious. They have scouts everywhere. One careless mistake, and we could be walking straight into their trap. That's why we move like shadows. Nobunaga replied, his tone unwavering. We are ghosts in this forest. Imagawa's men are used to large, imposing forces. They will not suspect a thing. As they continued deeper into the woods, the tension grew. Nobunaga could feel it. His men, though seasoned warriors, were unnerved by the quiet. They were used to the clash of swords, the cries of battle, but this was different. This was the quiet before a storm. Remember your orders. Nobunaga continued, turning to face his generals. Move swiftly, no noise. We strike fast and we strike hard. The enemy won't know what hit them. His generals nodded, and the troops fell into step, their formation becoming tighter as they neared the heart of Imagawa's camp. They were getting closer, and with each step, the reality of their plan became clearer. If they could get within striking distance without being detected, they might stand a chance. But if they were spotted, they would be facing an army far superior to theirs, and their chances of survival would be slim. Meanwhile, in Imagawa's camp, the mood was vastly different. The soldiers were confident, their leader's overwhelming strength giving them a sense of security. They had heard rumors of the Oda force's movements, but those rumors seemed more like whispers, nothing more than the kind of gossip soldiers exchanged when they were waiting for the real battle to begin. Imagawa Yoshimoto, sitting at his command tent, gazed over the map of Owari with a sense of satisfaction. His forces were spread out with no real threat in sight. His spies had reported no signs of movement from the Oda camp. His victory seemed inevitable. We'll crush them in a matter of days, one of Imagawa's generals said, smiling confidently as he pored over the battlefield strategies. It is a matter of when, not if, another added, but the complacency that surrounded Imagawa's camp would be his downfall. Nobunaga's small, stealthy force had already begun its march, moving through the forests and hills with the stealth of a predator stalking its prey. Imagawa's men were too sure of their superiority to suspect that their enemy was already within striking range. As Oda Nobunaga's army crept closer to their target, the tension in the air was palpable. The earth beneath their feet seemed to hum with anticipation. They were no longer just soldiers. They were shadows moving through the night like whispers on the wind. The march was long, and the distance to Imagawa's rear was far greater than they'd anticipated. Every tree, every rock seemed to hold its breath as they passed, aware that the slightest noise could spell the end of their daring plan. There was no room for mistakes. Not this time. We are nearly there, Mitsuhide whispered, as they approached the final stretch of their journey. If we can make it through these woods, we'll have the advantage. But we need to move quickly before they have the chance to react. Nobunaga nodded, his mind already turning toward the next step. They were close now, closer than they had ever been. And as they neared the enemy's vulnerable rear, the time for strategy was over. It was time for action. The surprise attack was almost within reach, and once they struck, there would be no turning back. Their fate and the fate of Owari hung in the balance. The march through the dense forest seemed endless, the air thick with moisture and the smell of earth. Each step felt heavier than the last as the protagonist and his comrades moved through the rough terrain, their feet slipping on the uneven ground, their armor clinking softly in the otherwise silent night. The path ahead was barely visible, obscured by the thick canopy of trees overhead. It felt as though they were marching into the very heart of the storm that was about to consume them. The deeper they went into the wilderness, the more the weight of the task ahead began to settle in. The forest had become their only ally, a cloak of darkness that shielded them from the eyes of Imagawa's scouts. But even here, in the quiet of the night, the tension was palpable. There was no turning back now. Their only chance of survival lay in the element of surprise. The protagonist glanced over at his comrades. Some were moving with practiced ease, their faces set in grim determination. But others seemed uncertain, their eyes darting nervously, as if expecting an enemy to leap out from behind every tree. The fear was there, visible in their stiffened postures, in the way they tightened their grips on their swords and shields. "It feels wrong," one of the younger soldiers muttered to his companion, his voice barely a whisper as he stumbled over a root. "This quiet. It's too quiet. The forest should feel alive, but all I hear is the sound of our boots and the wind. I don't like it." The older soldier, a veteran who had seen his share of battle, grunted in agreement. "It's unsettling, I'll give you that. But it's what we need right now. The silence is our weapon. If they hear us, it's over before it even starts." The protagonist's eyes lingered on them, hearing the fear in their voices, but he too felt the same unease. The quiet was unnatural. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the clash that was about to erupt. Even the birds, usually loud and vibrant at dawn, seemed to be holding their tongues. They had marched for hours, moving in the stillness of the night, careful to avoid any noise that might alert the enemy to their presence. The silence, heavy and suffocating, was beginning to feel like a burden. The protagonist's mind wandered back to the moments before they had set out. Nobunaga's words had been clear as always. "We strike at dawn. If we are seen before, then the battle is lost." There was no room for failure. None of them could afford to falter, not in this, not now. "Focus," the protagonist muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the path ahead. "We have one chance. There is no room for hesitation." Yet even as he spoke those words, doubts gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. What if they were spotted? What if the enemy was already waiting for them, lying in wait in the shadows, knowing exactly where they were headed? The uncertainty felt like a weight on his chest, each breath coming harder than the last. One of his comrades, Hiroshi, a tall, broad-shouldered man who had fought alongside him for years, stumbled slightly, his foot catching on a hidden rock. He muttered a curse under his breath, but quickly regained his balance. "You all right?" the protagonist asked, his voice low. "Just fine," Hiroshi replied gruffly, but there was a hint of strain in his voice. "It's just this damn forest. Never thought I'd be fighting in a place like this. It feels like the trees themselves are watching us." The protagonist's heart beat faster at those words. He had felt it too. The weight of the trees looming above them, the silence pressing in from all sides. The woods felt suffocating, oppressive. He couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was an adversary, as much as the men they would soon face in battle. As they trudged forward, The darkness seemed to stretch on forever. The shadows of the trees were becoming deeper, more foreboding. Every movement, every crack of a twig underfoot seemed amplified, as though they were walking through the very heart of a storm waiting to burst. Suddenly, the protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of rustling in the underbrush. His body tensed immediately. Did you hear that he whispered his hand instinctively, going to the hilt of his sword? The men around him froze their eyes wide. They had all heard it, the faint rustling of leaves, the subtle crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It could be Imagawa's scouts, already aware of their approach. The protagonist's pulse quickened. This was the moment. They had spent so long moving in silence, and now, as the final stretch of their march loomed ahead, everything seemed to hinge on this one moment of stillness. Would they be caught? Would their surprise attack be foiled before they could even reach Imagawa's rear? "Stay low," he commanded in a harsh whisper. "Keep moving. Don't make a sound. We don't know what's out there yet." The soldiers followed his command, moving like shadows through the dark forest, the tension tightening with each step. They moved deeper into the trees, each of them now hyper-aware of the sounds around them. The minutes stretched into an eternity as they pushed on the weight of the impending battle, making each step feel like a lifetime. Finally, the rustling stopped. The sound of footsteps faded into nothing. The protagonist's heart still pounded in his chest, but he dared not speak, not yet. They were too close now. Any moment of hesitation could spell their end. At last, as the sun began to break through the trees, casting pale light over the forest floor, Nobunaga's army emerged from the darkness of the forest and into the open field. They were close now, so close to the rear of Imagawa's army where their surprise attack would begin. The protagonist exhaled sharply, the tension of the march finally breaking. But as he gazed toward the distant encampment of Imagawa's forces, the true weight of the battle ahead sank in. They had come so far, but this was just the beginning. What awaited them now was far more dangerous than the terrain they had crossed. It was time to strike. The heavy silence of the forest began to break as the dense canopy opened up to reveal a vast open valley ahead. The earth beneath their feet was soft damp from the morning dew, and the air was thick with anticipation. The protagonist and his comrades could feel it, the quiet before the storm. After hours of trekking through the treacherous terrain, the Okehazama Valley lay before them, the final battleground where everything would be decided. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, the protagonist's gaze swept across the valley. It was deceptively peaceful. The fields were empty, the hills in the distance untouched by war. But the calm was fleeting. He could already feel the weight of the impending battle, and he knew that this tranquil scene would soon be consumed by the chaos of war. "We've made it," Hiroshi muttered, his voice low. The tiredness in his voice was evident, but there was no time for rest. They had come this far, and the stakes were higher than ever. The protagonist nodded, though his own thoughts were clouded with doubt. "We're not safe yet," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Imagawa's forces could be anywhere. We must move carefully." The men had been marching for hours, but as they neared the valley, the atmosphere became even more tense. They knew that this was the moment. No more forest to shield them, no more shadows to hide in. The open space of the valley left them vulnerable. One wrong move, one misplaced sound, and their entire strategy could fall apart. The calm exterior of the valley was an illusion, masking the storm of violence that would soon rage within it. They pressed on, walking carefully, their senses heightened. The protagonist could feel his pulse quickening as they moved toward the mouth of the valley where Imagawa's rear was vulnerable. The trees thinned out as they crossed into the valley's edge, their movements becoming more deliberate, each step measured and quiet. "Remember the plan," Nobunaga had said, his voice steady calm, even in the face of their dire situation. "We strike fast, and we strike where they least expect it. Our strength is in our speed and surprise." Now, with every step, the protagonist couldn't shake the weight of Nobunaga's words. They had been through so much to get here. The secrecy, the careful navigation of the forest, the near discovery by Imagawa's scouts, every part of their mission had been a gamble, and this final stretch would determine whether it was all for nothing. As they reached the valley floor, the protagonist's eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of the enemy. The landscape stretched out before them, and for a brief moment, he felt a fleeting sense of calm. The valley was quiet, serene, even, but that peace would soon be shattered by the violence of war. His thoughts were interrupted by Mitsuhide, who rode up beside him, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the land. "This is it," Mitsuhide said softly, the gravity of the moment settling over his words. "Imagawa's camp is just over the hill. We're almost in position. We mustn't delay any longer." The protagonist felt a rush of adrenaline at the mention of Imagawa's camp, the culmination of their journey now within reach. Every muscle in his body tensed. He could hear the faint sound of the wind rustling the tall grass in the valley, but beneath that, it was strangely quiet. Imagawa's forces were spread across the valley, unaware of the approaching storm. He glanced over his shoulder at the men who had followed him into the heart of this gamble. Their faces were hard, their eyes set in grim determination. But beneath the surface, he could sense the same unease that gnawed at him. No one spoke, but the fear was there, thick in the air, like the weight of the impending clash. "We wait for the signal," the protagonist muttered to himself, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. His grip was firm, but his thoughts swirled with doubt. It was almost too quiet, the calm before the inevitable chaos. They would either succeed and change the course of history or fail and face the consequences. As they neared the crest of the hill, the protagonist stopped and motioned for the others to halt. His breath was steady, but his heart raced in his chest, the sound of it almost drowning out the soft rustle of the wind. "It's time," he said, his voice calm but edged with the weight of what was to come. The rest of the men gathered around him, their expressions hardening as they prepared for the battle ahead. The moment had arrived. The final confrontation was within their grasp, and there was no turning back. The protagonist felt a deep, gnawing fear in his gut, a fear that was shared by every man in the army. They were about to face an overwhelming force, but with Nobunaga's brilliant strategy, their only chance lay in the element of surprise. "We strike when the sun is high," Nobunaga's voice echoed in the protagonist's mind. "We move fast, we hit hard, and we never stop until we have victory in our grasp." The protagonist nodded to himself, a final surge of resolve coursing through him. "We fight for our homes, for our families, for everything we've lost." And with that, they moved forward, their swords drawn, their hearts steeled for the battle that would soon engulf the valley. The Okehazama Valley, once serene and peaceful, would become a battleground, a place where the fate of Oda Nobunaga's ambitions would be decided. The protagonists' thoughts sharpened as they neared their destination. The time for hesitation was over. The war, the gamble, the fate of their land. It all rested on the next few moments. With a final breath, he set his eyes on the enemy camp ahead, knowing that this battle would either define their future or be their end. The valley was about to erupt into chaos, and with it, the roar of history would be heard. The protagonist stood at the edge of the valley, watching as his comrades readied themselves for the battle that was about to unfold. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of what was to come. His sword felt unnaturally heavy in his hand, the metal cold against his palm, and despite the heat of the day, a chill ran down his spine. The preparations were well underway, but a sense of unease gnawed at him. He looked around at the men, their faces hardened with determination, but he knew they were as nervous as he was. They were about to face an army far larger than their own, and all they had was the element of surprise and the hope that Nobunaga's plan would work. But how could they be sure? The silence in the air, the careful movements, the whispered orders, everything seemed like the calm before a storm. Yet no matter how many times the plan had been rehearsed, doubts still lingered. What if this is all for nothing? The protagonist thought to himself, feeling the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He had followed Nobunaga into battle before, and he had always believed in his leader's brilliance. But now, with the entire army of Imagawa so close and their own forces so small, the enormity of the task ahead seemed impossible. They were outnumbered by how much he couldn't even be certain anymore. What if they couldn't pull it off? What if the element of surprise wasn't enough? He watched as a few of the younger soldiers fidgeted nervously with their armor, their eyes darting between the hills and the distant enemy camp. They were frightened. He could see it in their movements, tensed shoulders, hands trembling slightly. They had no experience with a battle this large, and the weight of fear was heavier on them than anyone could admit. This isn't the kind of fight you can plan for, the protagonist thought, trying to steady his breathing. The battle was already in motion, but he was still stuck in his own head, weighing the consequences of what was about to happen. The plan was risky, incredibly risky. Nobunaga's idea, lure Imagawa's forces into a false sense of security, strike their rear, while they thought they were safe, seemed bold genius even, but it was so fragile. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and the entire strategy would collapse. They could easily be overwhelmed before they even had a chance to strike. How many of us will make it through? The question burned in his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to voice it. Fear wasn't something a samurai was allowed to show, but that didn't make it any less real. The weight of loyalty to Nobunaga, his duty to fight for his clan, all of it was crashing down on him. Was this the moment he had been training for? Or was this his end and the end of everything he had ever known? As he looked over to Nobunaga's command post, he could see his leader moving with unshakable confidence, issuing orders to his generals. Nobunaga had always been a force of nature, brilliant, unyielding, and undeniably charismatic. His strategies had won battles before, but this was different. He was asking them to do something that seemed impossible. The odds were against them, and they knew it. Yet Nobunaga's unwavering belief in their success gave them hope, even if it was hope that felt like a thin thread stretched across an abyss. What if I'm not enough? The thought passed through the protagonist's mind. As he glanced back at his comrades, their expressions set their hearts steeling for the chaos to come. He had fought before, faced enemies and bloodshed, but never like this. They weren't fighting a mere skirmish anymore. This battle could decide everything, not just the fate of their clan, but the very future of Japan. His gaze drifted back to the enemy camp, now only a short distance away. The soldiers of Imagawa, confident in their size, moved without the same tension that gripped Oda's army. They were spread out far too complacent, assuming the fight would come on their terms. They had no idea that the storm was already upon them. But even as he thought, that doubt crept in once more. What if their confidence was not just arrogance? What if they already knew something he didn't? What if they were waiting for them, lying in wait, like wolves ready to strike when they least expected it? This is madness, he thought, his chest tightening. We can't possibly succeed. We're too few and they're too strong. What if the gamble doesn't pay off? He knew he couldn't stand there questioning things any longer. Focus, he told himself, shaking the thought away. We fight because we must. We trust in Nobunaga's plan because it's all we have. But even as he tried to rally himself, a quiet nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that it might not be enough. He took a deep breath and gripped his sword tighter. His hands were sweating now, his mind spinning with what-ifs, but he couldn't allow himself to falter. Not now. He couldn't let fear take hold of him, not when so much depended on what came next. Nobunaga had believed in them, had trusted them to carry out this daring plan. He had to believe too. With the first sound of horns in the distance, signaling the beginning of the attack, the protagonist's heart skipped a beat. The moment was here. The tension that had built up in him and his comrades for so long was about to erupt. It was no longer about whether they would succeed. It was about how they would fight, how they would endure the chaos that was sure to follow. He looked at his comrades one last time, their faces set with determination. Despite the doubt, despite the fear, they were ready. They were here for one reason: to fight for their lord, for their land, for their lives. And as the battle horn sounded, he felt a surge of adrenaline course through him, silencing the fears that had plagued him moments before. It was time. There was no turning back now. The battle erupted like a sudden storm, violent and unforgiving. It started with the crack of a horn, sharp, commanding, and unmistakable. From the thick forest, the Oda forces surged forward, their movements swift and relentless. For a moment, the air was filled with nothing but the noise of their charge, the pounding of hooves, the clatter of armor, the rhythmic thud of footfalls. Imagawa's men spread out across the valley, and unaware of the threat, were caught completely off guard. They had been confident, too sure of themselves, expecting the Oda forces to make the first move from a distance, to stand and fight in open terrain. But Oda's plan had worked. Nobunaga's army had emerged from the woods, like ghosts, striking with an intensity and speed that left their enemies reeling. The protagonist's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the wave of soldiers, the world around him, spinning with the rush of adrenaline. They had crossed the valley's edge, charging straight into the heart of Imagawa's forces. Imagawa's rear guard, completely unprepared, was torn apart in a matter of seconds. The Oda warriors hit like a hammer to the anvil, forcing the disoriented enemy into chaos. For Oda, for our families, the protagonist shouted, his voice hoarse, blending with the roar of his comrades. His sword moved with practiced precision, cleaving through armor and bone. The enemy soldiers, still reeling from the shock of the ambush, were slow to react. Some tried to rally, but the speed and ferocity of the Oda forces overwhelmed them. The valley that had been so peaceful just moments ago now echoed with the clash of metal, the cries of the wounded, and the screams of those who realized too late that they were surrounded. Imagawa's forces, who had believed themselves safe in their complacency, now found themselves trapped between two unstoppable forces, the Oda army and the unforgiving terrain of the valley. As the protagonist fought his way through the chaos, he could feel the tension melting away, replaced by the pure focus of survival. His sword was an extension of himself, cutting down one enemy after another. His movements, a fluid dance, honed by years of training. But even in the midst of the violence, the sight of Imagawa's men struggling to regroup struck him like a cold weight. How could they have been so unprepared, he thought, as he took down another soldier. Were they truly so confident? Behind him, he could hear the sound of Nobunaga's voice bellowing orders. Push forward. Drive them into the hills. We can't give them a chance to regroup. The protagonist's gaze swept over the battlefield. Imagawa's men were scrambling, their formation shattered by the surprise attack. Panic was setting in. Some of the soldiers were abandoning their posts, fleeing into the woods in a desperate attempt to escape. Others were fighting, but their resolve was crumbling. The Oda forces pressed on, unrelenting, their momentum building with every second. The protagonist glanced over to his left, where a group of enemy soldiers had formed a defensive line, desperately trying to hold their ground. But their courage faltered as they saw their comrades retreating in fear. The realization spread like wildfire. This wasn't a battle they could win. This was their defeat. Push them back, the protagonist shouted to his comrades, urging them forward. His voice was swallowed by the noise of the battle, but it spurred them on a wave of energy surging through the Oda lines. They were like wolves closing in on a wounded prey, and Imagawa's forces were too disoriented to mount an effective defense. The protagonist ducked under a sword strike and cut down his attacker with a swift, brutal motion. The weight of his sword felt lighter now, his strikes more confident as the chaos of battle fueled him. He could see the panic spreading through the ranks of Imagawa's men. They were being driven into the hills, retreating in disarray, and the Oda forces showed no mercy. One of the enemy commanders, an officer in a distinctive helmet, attempted to rally his troops, raising his sword high above his head, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of Oda soldiers charging forward. His men, already broken and disorganized, had no will to fight. The commander's rallying cry was nothing more than a final, futile attempt to hold back the tide. "They're breaking," the protagonist muttered to himself, his heart pounding with both exhilaration and disbelief. Imagawa's once proud army was crumbling before his eyes. He had never imagined it would be so easy. But as the enemy's resistance faltered, the protagonist couldn't shake the cold feeling that settled in his gut. They had struck swiftly and decisively, but the sight of Imagawa's men, fleeing of soldiers, cutting down those who had already surrendered, left him feeling hollow. It wasn't the victory he had expected. There was no honor in this rout. No honor in seeing an army disbanded with such ease. Do we really deserve this victory? He thought momentarily, losing his focus as the battle raged on around him. Before he could dwell on it further, a shout broke through the haze of battle. He turned just in time to see Nobunaga at the forefront of the charge, his banner held high, a symbol of their triumph. The sight of their lord, a figure who had led them through countless battles, pushed the doubt from the protagonist's mind. This was his plan. This was their chance. The chaos had worked in their favor, and now there was no turning back. Drive them into the hills. Finish this. Nobunaga's command rang out sharp and clear. The Oda forces surged forward again. The fear that had plagued them at the start of the battle now replaced with the fierce joy of impending victory. The protagonist turned back to the battle, his focus sharpening. The ambush at Okehazama had shattered Imagawa's army, but the true victory, securing their future, was still to come. The battle was almost won, but there was still work to be done. And with that thought, he drove forward, cutting through the remnants of the enemy's disorganized lines, determined to finish what they had started. The Oda forces surged forward, with the relentless power of a storm, their swords flashing through the chaos like cutting winds. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they had the advantage of surprise, and they were using it to its fullest. The confusion among Imagawa's men was palpable. They had been expecting a drawn-out siege, a formal battle, but what they had faced was nothing more than a brutal, swift ambush. Imagawa's soldiers, once confident in their overwhelming strength, were now scattered, disoriented, and panicked. The protagonist moved through the battlefield, his sword flashing as he cut down another enemy soldier. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and blood, the clash of steel ringing in his ears. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his focus was sharp. His training had prepared him for this, but even so, there was something overwhelming about the sheer speed and intensity of the battle. Imagawa's men, who moments ago had been relaxed and sure of their victory, were now stumbling through a nightmare of disarray. "Keep pushing," the protagonist shouted to the soldiers around him, urging them to move faster to press the advantage. Their enemy was crumbling, and the scent of victory was in the air. But even as the battle raged around him, there was no sense of triumph in his chest, only a grim sense of inevitability. They were winning, but it felt too easy. "They're broken," Hiroshi, one of his closest comrades, said from beside him, his voice tight with exertion. He wiped blood from his forehead, his sword dripping with the blood of an enemy soldier. The protagonist nodded his eyes, scanning the battlefield. The enemy's once orderly lines had collapsed into chaos. The front lines, where Imagawa's strongest soldiers had stood, had been overrun with shocking speed. The flanks were wide open, and the soldiers were retreating in a panic, running in all directions. Imagawa's army, so sure of its superiority just hours before, was now nothing more than a disjointed rabble, desperately trying to regroup. But it was too late. The Oda forces, though smaller in number, were methodical, efficient, relentless. "Push them further back." Nobunaga's voice rang out, cutting through the madness of the battlefield. The protagonist turned to see their lord at the head of the charge, his banner held high, leading them forward with unyielding resolve. Nobunaga's presence was like a beacon in the chaos, guiding his men to victory. The protagonist's heart pounded in his chest as he followed. Despite the fear that still lingered in the back of his mind, the moment felt electric. They were winning. It was almost too easy. The Oda forces capitalized on the confusion, attacking the weakest points with precision and overwhelming force. Every soldier fought with the knowledge that they were part of something far greater than just a battle. They were part of a turning point in history. The enemy was panicking now, trying to regroup, but their leadership was nowhere to be found. The commanders, disoriented by the surprise attack, had lost control. Their soldiers were disbanding, scattering across the valley, too far gone to mount a proper defense. Imagawa's forces were crumbling under the weight of Oda's swift assault. "Do not let them escape," Nobunaga shouted again, his eyes burning with intensity. The Oda forces pushed harder, faster, cutting down those who tried to flee. The protagonist's sword never slowed, cutting through the disarray like a scythe through wheat. Every enemy he faced was overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of his strikes. It was a slaughter, but it was a slaughter born from the chaos of the ambush, and it was carried out with brutal efficiency. The disarray among Imagawa's soldiers was so complete that they could barely defend themselves. Those who tried to fight back were quickly cut down, their movements sluggish and panicked, while Oda's warriors were in perfect rhythm, calm, controlled, and decisive. The protagonist's body moved on instinct now, every strike sharp, every movement practiced. He didn't think anymore. His mind was clear, his focus absolute. He was no longer just a soldier in a battle. He was a part of something larger, a force moving through the chaos. His sword cut through the last of the enemy's front line, and the air was filled with the sharp, satisfying sound of metal meeting flesh. And then it was over. The once proud forces of Imagawa had been shattered. The survivors were fleeing into the hills, scattered and broken with no leadership to guide them. Imagawa's camp was in ruins, the once confident warlord's army reduced to little more than a broken shell. The Oda forces, though still smaller in number, had decimated their enemy, pushing forward with a relentless fury that had caught Imagawa completely off guard. The protagonist stood at the edge of the battlefield, his breath coming in heavy gasps. His sword was slick with blood, his armor battered from the fight. The cries of the wounded filled the air, but there was a strange sense of calm now, a stillness after the storm. The dust had settled, and the once impregnable force of Imagawa was in full retreat. "We've done it," Hiroshi said, standing beside him, his eyes wide in disbelief. "We've actually done it." The protagonist turned to face the chaos around him, his mind still reeling from the speed and ferocity of the battle. The overwhelming odds, the overwhelming fear, none of it had mattered in the end. They had struck fast, and they had struck hard. The battle was won. But as the protagonist looked around at the wreckage of the enemy's forces, something gnawed at him. The victory felt hollow. The enemies had fallen so easily, and the aftermath felt less like triumph and more like the inevitable consequence of war. He had fought for Oda, fought for his comrades, but in the aftermath, it all felt too brutal, too swift. But even as the doubt lingered, he knew one thing for sure: this was a turning point. This battle, this victory would change everything. Oda Nobunaga had proven his brilliance once again, and the future of Japan was now a little closer to being in his hands. The protagonist took a deep breath, his heart still racing, and turned to follow the others. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The protagonist's heart hammered in his chest as he fought, each strike of his sword a heartbeat, each clash with the enemy a step closer to victory or death. The valley, once serene and peaceful, had become a maelstrom of blood steel and screams. The battle had erupted in a chaos that was both violent and relentless. Imagawa's forces, disoriented and scrambling to recover from the surprise, were no match for the speed and precision of the Oda warriors. For Oda, the protagonist shouted his voice, merging with the cries of his comrades. His sword cut through the air with practiced ease, cleaving through the armor of an Imagawa soldier who had tried to block his attack. The man collapsed to the ground, his eyes wide with terror as life drained from him. Around him, Nobunaga's men fought with a ferocity that matched the intensity of the surprise assault. The Oda forces, though fewer in number, moved like a well-oiled machine, coordinated, swift, and precise. They exploited every weakness, capitalizing on the chaos and confusion among the enemy. The protagonist's eyes darted across the battlefield. Imagawa's soldiers were falling back, many of them, in a complete rout. The once proud formations had dissolved into disarray. Panic had set in. Soldiers who had once moved with confidence were now stumbling, their swords lowered in fear. The sound of retreating footsteps mixed with the clash of Oda swords cutting through the enemy. It was as if the world had shifted. The balance of power had tipped in an instant, and now it was the Oda forces who dictated the flow of the battle. The protagonist saw Hiroshi, his comrade from earlier, cutting down an enemy officer who had tried to rally his men. The officer's desperate attempts to form a line were shattered as Hiroshi's blade found its mark, slicing through the man's neck with a sickening thud. Blood spurted from the wound, spraying across the ground. The protagonist's stomach twisted at the sight, but there was no time for hesitation. This was war. It was brutal. It was unforgiving. "Keep moving," Hiroshi yelled, barely pausing as he wiped his blade clean. The protagonist nodded grimly and pressed forward. They couldn't afford to pause, couldn't afford to give the enemy a chance to regroup. The Oda forces pushed onward, driving Imagawa's army further into disarray. Everywhere he looked, there was carnage. The battlefield was a blur of movement, the ground slick with the blood of the fallen. The cries of the wounded echoed across the valley, mingling with the shrill sounds of clashing steel. The protagonist's senses were overwhelmed by the chaos, by the flashes of steel, the stench of blood, and the pounding of his own heart. But amidst the chaos, there was a strange clarity. They were winning. Imagawa's forces, though larger, were disintegrating under the sheer force of the Oda assault. "We have them on the run," a voice called from behind. It was Mitsuhide, his face smeared with blood, his eyes wild with the thrill of battle. "Push them further. We'll break them completely." The protagonist glanced around at the disarray. The front lines of Imagawa's army had collapsed. Many soldiers were dropping their weapons and fleeing into the hills. The Oda forces were relentless, closing in on the enemy, cutting off their avenues of escape. Every direction they turned, they were met by a relentless Oda warrior, each strike and thrust bringing them closer to complete defeat. Yet even as the tide of battle turned in their favor, the protagonist felt a knot in his stomach. The brutality of the slaughter was overwhelming. The enemy's retreating soldiers begged for mercy, but the Oda forces showed none. It was a necessary cruelty, he knew, but that didn't make it any easier to watch. His own hands, bloodied from his efforts, shook slightly as he fought, but there was no time to dwell on it. His duty was to fight to survive and to ensure victory. He fought alongside Mitsuhide, who was cutting down enemy after enemy with surgical precision. The veteran samurai's face was set in a grim line, his focus absolute. Finish them, Mitsuhide muttered as he swung his sword in a wide arc, cleaving through an enemy soldier who had been foolish enough to challenge him. There's no mercy in war, only victory. The protagonist nodded, swallowing the bitter taste in his mouth. There was no place for hesitation here. Imagawa's men had shown their weakness by underestimating Oda, and now they would pay for it. But the protagonist couldn't help but wonder, was this victory worth the cost? As the last of Imagawa's rear guard broke and fled, the protagonist's sword fell heavy in his hand. The battle was over, but it had been brutal. There was no fanfare, no cheering, just the quiet aftermath of carnage. The valley, which had been filled with the sounds of battle, was now eerily quiet, save for the moans of the wounded and the distant cries of retreating soldiers. Nobunaga's forces had claimed the field, but the protagonist's mind was filled with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. They had won, yes, but at what cost? How many had died on both sides for what? The ambition of one man, the thirst for power. The blood of men had soaked the ground, and in the midst of his exhaustion, the protagonist couldn't escape the hollow feeling that lingered deep within him. "We've done it," Hiroshi said, breathing heavily, his eyes wild with adrenaline. "We've won?" But the protagonist said nothing. He looked around, the weight of the battlefield settling in. They had won the day, but tomorrow there would be more battles to fight, more blood to spill. And in the back of his mind, the question remained, was it worth it? The battle had been a decisive victory for Oda Nobunaga, but the true cost of war, its toll on the soul, was a price he could not yet fully comprehend. The protagonist's breath came in quick, ragged gasps as he plunged into the fray. The world around him blurred into chaos, sword strikes, shouts, the heavy thud of boots against the blood-soaked earth. The rhythmic clash of metal on metal rang in his ears as he ducked under an enemy's swing and brought his sword up in a quick, sharp arc. The enemy soldier's body crumpled to the ground, blood spraying in all directions. For Oda. The battle cry surged from his lips without thought, the words blending with the deafening sounds of the war unfolding around him. His pulse raced, his heart thumping in his chest as adrenaline surged through his veins. The battlefield was a blur, a landscape of violence and death. Yet the protagonist felt strangely detached from it all. His movements were automatic, honed by years of training. But as his sword struck again and again, he couldn't escape the weight of what was happening. Each blow he struck felt heavier than the last, and each moment seemed to drag on in a blur of steel and screams. He saw his comrades fighting alongside him, their faces set in grim determination. But there was no time to consider their fates. He was too deep in it now, too far into the madness to think of anything but the fight itself. His body moved on instinct, his sword a blur as it cut through the confusion. But even in the heat of the battle, something inside him twisted. The soldier who had fallen before him, he had been someone's son, perhaps someone's brother. The blood that stained the earth beneath his feet wasn't just blood. It was a life lost, a family torn apart, and yet here he was, fighting to protect his lord, fighting to survive. Was it worth it? Was any of this worth the carnage? A scream split the air, drawing his attention. A young soldier, one of the new recruits, was struggling beneath the weight of a much larger man. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. He pushed forward, cutting down another enemy in his path before reaching the boy, pulling him to safety with a quick motion. "Stay with me, boy," he shouted, his voice hoarse, filled with urgency. The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with terror, his hands trembling as he gripped his sword. He nodded, too frightened to speak, and stumbled to his feet. The protagonist shoved him toward a safer part of the battlefield, his own body moving mechanically now. His mind was no longer fully present. He was caught between the rush of victory and the crushing weight of the violence that surrounded him. For every enemy he cut down, for every victory he seized, the burden of it grew heavier. There was no time to think, no time to process the faces of the fallen. The fight continued, a whirlwind of flashing swords, bodies colliding, men falling to the ground. The protagonist's own blade struck again, cutting down another soldier in a single fluid motion. But this time he saw the man's face, young, scared eyes wide with terror. His sword had slipped right through the man's defense, and as the soldier crumpled to the earth, the protagonist felt a chill run through him. "What am I doing?" The thought came unbidden, breaking through the haze of battle. For a moment, the world around him seemed to slow. He stood over the fallen soldier, watching as blood poured from the man's wound, pooling on the ground. He had been so young, so full of life, only moments before. And now, he was just another casualty, another face in the pile of bodies. The protagonist's sword dropped slightly in his hand, and for the briefest moment, doubt crept in. Was this really the path he had chosen? Was this what it meant to be a samurai? To fight to kill for an idea, for a lord, for a dream. How many lives had he taken already? How many more would he take before this was over? But then from somewhere deep inside, the rush of victory surged again. "Keep fighting," he told himself, the words a mantra, a lifeline. The battle was still on. Imagawa's forces were faltering. They were on the edge of defeat, and Oda's victory was within their grasp. He couldn't afford to falter now, couldn't afford to question it, not when so much was at stake. "Victory," he whispered under his breath, his grip tightening around his sword. "We must win. For Oda. For the future." But even as he fought, the question lingered at the back of his mind. At what cost? The battlefield became a blur once more, the chaos of war swallowing him up again. He fought with a newfound ferocity, pushing aside the doubts that threatened to drown him. But each blow felt heavier now, and with every enemy that fell, the weight of the violence grew. Finally, as the last of Imagawa's men fled into the hills, the protagonist stood in the middle of the valley, surrounded by the aftermath of the slaughter. His body was drenched in sweat and blood, his sword heavy in his hand. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his chest ached with exhaustion. The battle had been won, but the victory felt hollow. The valley, once peaceful, was now littered with the bodies of the fallen. The carnage, the violence, it was all too much to bear. The protagonist stood still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the ground, the weight of what he had just done pressing down on him like a stone. He had fought for victory. He had fought for his lord. But at what cost? What now? He thought, the question lingering in his mind. He had won the battle, but the true cost of this victory of war was something he wasn't sure he could ever reconcile. The dust of the battlefield was still settling when the news reached them. The body of Imagawa Yoshimoto had been found lying motionless at the foot of the hill where his forces had tried to regroup in their final moments of resistance. His death had come as a swift and decisive blow to the heart of his army, and with it, his reign had crumbled. The once feared warlord, whose name had commanded fear and respect across Japan, was now nothing more than a cold, lifeless corpse in the dirt. The protagonist stood among his fellow samurai, their eyes focused on the body. Imagawa's men had scattered in every direction, many surrendering, others fleeing into the hills, and some simply laying down their arms. The remnants of a once proud army were now a broken, scattered force, their leader gone. The battle was over, and the victory was theirs. Yet even as the cries of triumph echoed in the distance, a strange, uneasy silence hung over the battlefield. The protagonist felt the weight of it pressing down on him like the very air itself. They had won, yes. Imagawa's power had been shattered. But the body of the fallen warlord, once a symbol of dominance, now seemed to represent something more, the end of an era. The end of one man's ambition, and the beginning of another's. Imagawa is dead, Hiroshi muttered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had fought alongside the protagonist for years, and this moment, the moment they had been waiting for, had finally arrived. We've done it. We've crushed his power. But the protagonist's gaze did not leave the body of Imagawa. Yes, we've done it, he echoed, though his voice lacked the triumphant conviction he had expected to feel. His eyes lingered on the still form of the fallen warlord, a man who had once commanded thousands and now lay powerless beneath the weight of his own ambition. It's over now. Hiroshi continued, his voice more certain. The battlefield is ours, and Oda is rising. The protagonist nodded, but something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the victory, as decisive as it was, came with a price one far higher than he had initially understood. Around them, Oda's men began to cheer. The soldiers, who had fought so hard for their lord, were filled with a kind of savage joy, their voices rising in celebration. Some raised their swords in the air, others embraced each other, shouting of their victory. The camp had fallen silent, but the sense of triumph was undeniable. Oda Nobunaga had done it. His strategy had crushed Imagawa's forces, and the path to power was now open before him. The protagonist's gaze shifted toward Nobunaga, who stood some distance away, surrounded by his closest generals. He was speaking quietly with them, but there was no mistaking the satisfaction in his face. He had won. His gamble had paid off, and with Imagawa's death, the land of Owari and beyond now seemed within his grasp. Nobunaga had always been brilliant, a tactician whose unorthodox methods had brought him this far. His surprise attack had shattered Imagawa's army in a matter of hours. The methodical precision of the strike had left no room for doubt. It had been a masterstroke, a plan executed with such ferocity and speed that Imagawa's forces hadn't even had time to react. The protagonist watched Nobunaga, feeling a surge of pride for their lord's victory. This was the moment they had all fought for. The Oda clan's power was now secured, and Nobunaga's rise to dominance seemed inevitable. Yet, as the protagonist stood there watching the celebrations unfold, an unsettling thought lingered in the back of his mind. What now? The warlord's body lay lifeless in the dirt, but what had they truly won? The blood that had been spilled on the valley floor would not easily wash away. Imagawa's reign had ended. But what of the countless lives lost in the battle? What of the farmers and civilians caught in the crossfire of ambition? What of the land torn apart by years of war? Its soil now soaked with the blood of the fallen. For what? The question hung in the air unanswered. For a new ruler to rise, only to start the same cycle again. Nobunaga's rise had been swift and ruthless. He had shown no hesitation in striking the first blow, exploiting Imagawa's weaknesses with precision. The protagonist had followed him unquestioningly, believing in his vision and his ambition. But as he stood amidst the bloodshed and chaos, the toll of war seemed clearer than ever. The victory was undeniable, but so was the cost. His gaze moved to the distant hills, where smoke still rose from the remains of Imagawa's camp. The fires of war were burning bright, and even as Oda's men celebrated, the protagonist couldn't help but feel that the fire was consuming more than just their enemies. It was consuming the very soul of the land. Is this what we've come to? The protagonist wondered silently, his thoughts clouded with doubt. The battle was won, but at what cost? Nobunaga's rise, though brilliant, had been built on the foundation of blood and violence. And now, with Imagawa's death, the world would change once more. But would it be any better? He turned away from the celebrations, his sword heavy in his hand. The victor was obvious, but the price of that victory was something he wasn't sure he could fully comprehend. The blood on his hands, the blood on all their hands, was a burden that would not be easily forgotten. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, the protagonist knew that the war was far from over. The rise of Oda Nobunaga was only the beginning. And while he felt pride in their victory, a deep unease lingered in his heart, a realization that the price of power was far greater than he had ever imagined. The battle for the future of Japan had only just begun. The days following the victory at Okehazama were filled with the noise of change of footsteps on the march, the clinking of armor, the harsh orders of generals, and the low murmur of soldiers. Nobunaga had wasted no time in consolidating his power. The lands once controlled by Imagawa Yoshimoto were now under Oda's rule. The protagonist watched as Nobunaga's influence spread, his presence growing more imposing by the day. In the town square of a newly conquered village, the Oda banners were raised high, fluttering in the wind. Nobunaga's troops had already set up a small garrison, and the local samurai, those who had once sworn allegiance to Imagawa, were now being forced to swear loyalty to the Oda Lord. The protagonist stood silently at the back of the gathering, his eyes scanning the faces of the men who knelt before Nobunaga. Their expressions were filled with fear. Fear not just for their lives, but for the future. The fear of aligning with a man whose ambition had already cost countless lives. Nobunaga stood tall before them, a commanding figure, his expression hard and unreadable. He spoke with the authority of a man who had conquered more than just land. He had conquered the very wills of those around him. Swear loyalty to me, and I will give you power. Refuse, and I will have no mercy. His voice was like iron, unyielding and resolute. The men knelt, bowing their heads in quick, sharp movements. It was not reverence they showed, but submission. The protagonist felt a chill as he watched the scene unfold, a coldness that lingered in his bones. As the last of the samurai rose, their oaths sworn, the protagonist's gaze flicked to Nobunaga. The Oda Lord's face remained impassive, but there was something unsettling in the way he held himself, something that spoke of ambition, so sharp it could cut through anything in its path. Later that evening, as the camp settled into its nightly rhythm, the protagonist found himself walking with Mitsuhide, his trusted comrade and advisor. The two had fought side by side in many battles, and though they shared a deep loyalty to Nobunaga, there was a growing tension in the air. The protagonist couldn't ignore it any longer. "Do you think they truly respect him?" the protagonist asked quietly, glancing over at Nobunaga, who was in deep conversation with his generals by the fire. "Or is it just fear that binds them to him?" Mitsuhide's face was unreadable. He was a man of few words, but the look he gave the protagonist spoke volumes. "There is respect, yes," Mitsuhide said slowly. "But more than that, there is fear. Nobunaga commands it. He conquers with strength, not just tactics." The protagonist looked back toward the fire, where Nobunaga's figure loomed large in the flickering light. There was no denying the power he had gained, nor the loyalty he commanded. But the protagonist had begun to see something else beneath the surface, a deepening tension among the samurai who followed him. Nobunaga's rise to power had been swift, but the way he had acquired that power through brutal force, calculated strategy, and ruthless conquest left no room for doubt. His rule would not be one of mercy. It would be a reign of iron. In the days that followed, Nobunaga expanded his reach, moving swiftly to consolidate his power over the territories now under his control. Villages and towns that had once sworn allegiance to Imagawa were now bending the knee to the Oda Lord. The protagonist watched as more and more samurai came to swear loyalty. But with each new oath came a growing unease. The tension was palpable among the men who followed him, among the samurai who had once served under Imagawa, and within himself. How long can this last, the protagonist wondered, as he watched another round of oaths being sworn. How long until this fear turns to rebellion? He had seen it before, men who had been forced to swear loyalty to a lord they didn't respect, only for that resentment to fester and grow. He knew how fragile such loyalty could be. And yet there was no denying that Nobunaga had an iron grip on the lands he had conquered. His ambition was a force that could not be ignored, and the men who had followed him into battle were beginning to understand just how far that ambition would carry him. Victory in war is not the end, the protagonist thought bitterly. It is merely the beginning of something more dangerous. The Oda forces had crushed Imagawa's army. Yes, but the land was not at peace. Imagawa's supporters, those who had been loyal to the fallen warlord, were still out there waiting. The villages and towns that had once been neutral now feared the consequences of aligning with the wrong side. And Nobunaga's tactics, though brilliant, left little room for forgiveness. It was the same path that had led them to victory at Okehazama, and it was the same path that would continue to lead them forward through bloodshed, fear, and the burning desire for power. As the protagonist sat alone in his tent that evening, his sword resting by his side, he couldn't shake the unease that lingered in his chest. He had followed Nobunaga into battle, and he had won. They had all won. But at what cost? What had been the price of this victory? And more troubling still, what would the cost be in the future? Nobunaga's rise had been meteoric, but the price of that power was becoming clearer with each passing day. Loyalty, the protagonist thought bitterly. Is it truly loyalty when it is forced? Is it loyalty when the price of disobedience is death? The protagonist had always believed in the samurai code, honor, loyalty, and duty. But now, as he stood on the precipice of a new era under Nobunaga's rule, he couldn't help but question whether the very ideals he had lived by were being twisted beyond recognition. Victory had come at the cost of countless lives, and the bloodshed had only just begun. Nobunaga's ambition knew no bounds, and the protagonist was beginning to realize that in this world of power and conquest, loyalty was not always the noble, honorable force he had once thought it to be. The Oda Lord had risen through blood and war, and as the protagonist looked out into the darkening horizon, he wondered just how far Nobunaga's ruthless ambition would carry them all, and whether they would ever find peace in the aftermath. The camp was unusually quiet that night. The usual hum of activity, the sharpening of swords, the rustling of armor, the sounds of soldiers preparing for battle had been replaced by an uneasy stillness. The protagonist sat alone by the campfire, his sword resting at his side, the flickering light casting long shadows across his face. The victory at Okehazama had brought them closer to their goal. Nobunaga's ambition was steadily turning into reality, but with that power came a dark undercurrent of fear and suspicion. The protagonist's mind kept returning to the actions of the last few days. Nobunaga, the tactician, had begun to make decisions that unsettled even his most loyal followers. It had started with the quiet executions of a few of Imagawa's former officers, men who had surrendered and pledged their loyalty to Oda in the aftermath of the battle. But it didn't stop there. One by one, Nobunaga's former allies, those who had helped him rise to power, were being eliminated under the guise of disloyalty or conspiracy. One such victim had been Atsushi, a respected general in Nobunaga's army, who had served with distinction under the Oda banner for years. Atsushi had been one of the first to swear allegiance to Nobunaga when he had been a rising warlord, and the two had shared a bond forged in the fires of war. But the bond, like so many others, had been severed. Atsushi had been accused of plotting against Nobunaga, a charge no one could verify, but one that once whispered could not be ignored. The protagonist had watched horrified as Atsushi was dragged away by Oda's soldiers, his pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears. This is how it starts, the protagonist thought bitterly as he stared into the fire. First the enemies, then the allies. Nobunaga will stop at nothing to secure his power. The news of Atsushi's death had spread quickly through the camp, leaving a bitter taste in the mouths of many of the samurai. Some were silent, their loyalty to Nobunaga unwavering, but others were beginning to question his methods. "Does he not trust us?" one of the younger soldiers had whispered just loud enough for the protagonist to overhear. "Are we all just tools to him?" Betrayal, the protagonist thought the word echoing in his mind. Betrayal is in the air. Nobunaga's ruthlessness, once admired for its efficiency, was now beginning to feel like a shadow that loomed over them all. The protagonist had always believed that the path to power was paved with blood. That was the reality of war. But this was different. Nobunaga wasn't just eliminating enemies. He was eradicating any potential threat, no matter how small, no matter how close. And with every act of betrayal, it felt like the very fabric of their loyalty was being torn apart. As the protagonist walked through the camp, his gaze inevitably drifted to the faces of the men around him, his comrades, his brothers in arms. Some looked as they always had, their eyes hard with resolve, their bodies tense with the readiness for battle. But there was a difference now. The tension was not just from the anticipation of future wars. It was the fear of who might be next. Who would fall under Nobunaga's suspicion tomorrow? Who would be accused of plotting against him, even if they had done nothing more than speak too freely or ask too many questions? One evening, the protagonist was approached by Tadakatsu, a fellow samurai who had fought alongside him since the early days of their campaign. Tadakatsu's face was drawn, his expression clouded with a mixture of anger and frustration. "Did you hear?" Tadakatsu asked, his voice low. "Another one of our own is gone, and this time it's Katsuya." The protagonist felt his stomach tighten. Katsuya had been one of the most respected among them, a man who had once fought with unmatched honor. His death, like Atsushi's, had been swift with no explanation. The rumors whispered through the camp spoke of treason, of betrayal, but no one had seen any signs of it. There had been no plot, no evidence, just a man who had been dragged away, never to return. "When does it stop?" Tadakatsu muttered bitterly. "When does it stop? And we can just be." Again, we fought for him, bled for him, and this is what we get. The protagonist didn't have an answer. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. He could feel the tension in the camp, growing, the uneasy looks exchanged between comrades, the whispered doubts in the corners of the campfires. The samurai who had once followed Nobunaga with unwavering loyalty were beginning to falter. The price of loyalty was becoming too high. The protagonist stood there torn. He had always believed in the samurai code, honor, loyalty, and duty. But he had also believed in justice, in the idea that those who fought and bled for their lord would be treated with respect. Nobunaga had risen to power through bloodshed, yes, but he had done so with the support of men like him, men who believed in his vision, in his promise to bring order to a fractured nation. But now, with every betrayal, every life taken in the name of security, the protagonist was beginning to wonder if that promise was just another lie. Was this really the future they had fought for? Or was this just the beginning of a cycle of blood that would never end? As Nobunaga sat in his tent, surrounded by his generals, making plans for the next conquest, the protagonist watched from a distance. He had always admired Nobunaga's brilliance, his ability to see a future others could not. But now, as he watched the Oda Lord command the loyalty of men, through fear and ruthlessness, he couldn't help but question the price of that power. What is the true cost of ambition? The protagonist thought, the question echoing louder in his mind with each passing day. Betrayal, ambition. And the cold reality of war had begun to twist what had once been a cause he could believe in. The protagonist could no longer ignore the dark truth that was unfolding before him. He had fought for Oda, fought for Nobunaga's vision of a unified Japan, but now he wasn't so sure what that vision truly meant. Is it worth it? The protagonist thought as he turned away from the campfire. Is this the price of power? He wasn't sure anymore. The unrelenting march of Oda Nobunaga's army continued across Japan, leaving behind a trail of defeated warlords and crumbled alliances. As each new territory fell to his forces, the vision of a unified Japan grew closer to realization. But the cost of that vision was beginning to weigh heavily on the protagonist. The land once fractured and at war with itself was slowly being bent to Nobunaga's will. But at what cost? The further Oda's power spread, the further his sense of loss deepened. The protagonist had once believed that the samurai code, honor, loyalty, and duty, was the foundation of their cause. But with each new conquest, each new battle, he saw that the lines between honor and ambition had become increasingly blurred. The ideals he had once followed so fervently now seemed more like a facade, a convenient set of rules that masked the cold reality of power and bloodshed. In the quiet of his tent, one night after another successful campaign, the protagonist found himself staring at the map of Japan, watching as Oda's territory expanded. The names of defeated warlords were crossed out, their territories marked in the familiar red ink of Oda's control. But as the map filled with more victories, the protagonist's heart grew heavier. This is what we fought for. He thought, the question lingering like a cold whisper. More land, more power. Is this truly the future we were promised? The land was certainly being united, but the cost of that unity was written in the blood of countless men. Each victory was tainted with the violence of war, the cries of the dying, and the endless sacrifices. He had stood beside Nobunaga through it all, through the battles, the betrayals, the bloodshed, and yet the more he saw, the less he understood what they were fighting for. His growing disillusionment came to a head during a campaign to defeat a rival warlord to the north, Takeda Shingen. The battle was fierce, with Nobunaga's forces once again outnumbered but determined to crush the resistance. The protagonist fought at Nobunaga's side, but the whole experience left him shaken. As the warlord's army was driven back, one of his generals, a man who had fought with Nobunaga for years, fell in the chaos. The protagonist, drenched in sweat and blood, had watched as the man bled out in his arms. There was no honor in his death, no glory, just a man who had been sacrificed to further Nobunaga's ambition. Is this what we've become? The question haunted him as he stared at the fallen general's face, now lifeless and empty of the fire that had once burned in his eyes. Just tools in a game of power. When the battle was won and the field began to clear, the Oda forces moved forward, already thinking of their next conquest. But the protagonist's mind remained frozen in place. For the first time, he truly questioned whether the bloodshed was worth it. In the weeks that followed, Nobunaga's forces continued to sweep through Japan, quelling rebellions and defeating rival warlords with brutal efficiency. One by one, the enemies of Oda fell, and with each victory, Nobunaga's power grew stronger. But with each new conquest, the protagonist's sense of self began to unravel. The cost of these victories was no longer something he could ignore. Do we truly serve Nobunaga, or have we become pawns in his endless thirst for power? The thought gnawed at him, and he found himself distancing from those around him. Even the camaraderie he had once felt with his fellow samurai seemed distant now. They fought not for a cause they believed in, but for a man whose ambition knew no bounds. It was no longer about honor, it was about survival. And the price of survival was growing more unbearable with each passing day. As the protagonist wrestled with these doubts, new enemies began to emerge. Some old warlords rising in defiance of Oda's expansion, others former allies now turned traitors, seeking to take advantage of the power vacuum left in the wake of Nobunaga's victories. It was no longer a matter of fighting to unite the land, it was about fighting to maintain control. Nobunaga's paranoia began to grow as well, his suspicions spreading among his own men. The once loyal samurai were now treated with increasing mistrust, and those who had once fought for Oda's vision were now seen as potential threats to his rule. One evening, the protagonist overheard a conversation between two of Nobunaga's generals, their voices low and filled with concern. "The warlords may be defeated, but we can't keep going like this. How much longer can we hold together?" One said, his voice filled with quiet worry. "Don't speak of it," the other replied harshly. "It's better we stay silent. Nobunaga's eyes are everywhere now. If he suspects—" The words hung in the air like a dark omen, and the protagonist's blood ran cold. Even his closest comrades were beginning to fear the very man they had once served without question. Nobunaga's ruthlessness was not just against his enemies, it was beginning to turn inward. The more power he gained, the more he sought to control every aspect of the lands he had conquered, and the more he suspected that even those closest to him might betray him. The protagonist had always been loyal, but now he found himself questioning that loyalty. Was this what they had fought for? A unified Japan, built on the backs of broken men, held together by fear and blood. The once strong ideals of the samurai honor and loyalty were starting to feel like ghosts hollow and distant in the face of the reality Nobunaga had created. "Is this what I've become?" the protagonist wondered, looking out across the camp at the faces of the men around him. A tool of power, a pawn in a game of ambition. Nobunaga's vision of a unified Japan seemed closer than ever. But with each victory, the protagonist grew more disillusioned. The world was changing. But was it changing for the better? Or was it simply a new, bloodier version of the same old cycle of war? As Nobunaga's forces continued to push forward, the protagonist found himself standing at a crossroads. His loyalty to Nobunaga was unwavering, but his understanding of that loyalty and what it truly meant was beginning to change. He had fought for the rise of Oda, but now he wasn't sure if the cost of that rise was worth the bloodshed and violence that had come with it. Victory in war, it seemed, only led to more war. And the path to unification, no matter how noble the cause might seem, was built on the bodies of those who had fallen along the way. The sun was barely setting when the order came. The protagonist had been stationed at the edge of the camp, cleaning his blade and trying to quiet the storm of thoughts that had been churning inside him since the last campaign. The conquest of yet another rival warlord had been swift, efficient, but the cost of that victory, like all the others, was mounting. "The time has come," came the voice of one of Nobunaga's trusted generals, his tone cold and unreadable. "You're to join the raid. The traitors need to be dealt with swiftly." The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. The traitors were former allies, samurai, who had once served under Oda, but were now suspected of secretly aligning with rival factions. Nobunaga, ever the pragmatist, saw these men as a threat, and as such, they had been marked for death. The protagonist had known that Nobunaga's ambition would demand sacrifices, but this it felt different. The blood of their own was being shed in the name of conquest, and it was a bitter pill to swallow. What's your take on this? Tadakatsu, the protagonist, asked, his voice low. His fellow samurai. Tadakatsu stood beside him, eyes downcast as the orders were handed out. Tadakatsu sighed, his expression hardening. It's just a part of the game, isn't it? He muttered almost to himself. The more power Nobunaga gets, the more he'll need to eliminate those who can threaten it. We either obey or get crushed underfoot, just like the rest. The words struck the protagonist like a blow to the chest. The cold, simple truth of it, that loyalty had become a currency in Nobunaga's rise, one that could be exchanged, spent, or discarded at will, began to settle in his mind. Is this what we've become? The thought lingered, but he shoved it aside. There was no time to reflect now. His duty was clear. The next night, under the cover of darkness, the protagonist and a group of elite samurai set out for the traitors' hideout, a small village just on the outskirts of the conquered territory. The order was clear: eliminate them. No trial, no questions asked. The journey was silent, the night air cold against their skin. The protagonist could hear the sound of his own breathing, the rhythmic thud of his boots on the dirt road, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the same question. How far had they come? By the time they reached the village, the tension in the air was palpable. The small, simple houses stood quiet and dark under the moonlight. There was no sign of the traitors. Their betrayal had been swift, but so was their retreat. Yet the order was given, and there was no turning back now. The samurai moved swiftly, surrounding the village, their swords drawn and ready. Clear them out, came the low command from the general in charge of the raid. No survivors. The protagonist's sword felt heavier than it had before. The weight of it, the weight of his duty, was suffocating. As he moved forward with the others, he saw the terror in the eyes of the villagers. They knew something terrible was coming, and yet it wasn't the villagers who were the target. It was their own. The traitors, those who had once fought for Nobunaga, were now cowering in the homes they had built with their families. The protagonist's hand tightened around his sword as he forced himself to focus. This is the price of loyalty, he told himself, the price of power. What followed was a brutal, swift confrontation. The traitors had no chance to fight back. The protagonist stood amidst the chaos, his blade slashing through the air, cutting down those who had once been his brothers in arms. His heart raced his body, moving on instinct, the brutal efficiency of the raid leaving no room for mercy. But as the final screams of the traitors echoed through the village, a sickening feeling settled deep in the protagonist's gut. These men were not enemies. They were not invaders. They were his own people, once loyal to Oda, now silenced for their perceived disloyalty. He had killed before, but this felt different. This wasn't a battle. It wasn't a fight for survival. It was a purge. A reminder that in Nobunaga's world, loyalty was earned through blood. Is this justice? The protagonist thought, his sword dripping with blood. He turned away from the carnage, unable to face the remains of those who had once shared his cause? Or is this just another step toward the kind of power that leaves no room for honor? The following day, word spread through the camp of the raid's success. The traitors had been eliminated. Nobunaga's control over the region was now absolute. His enemies, both external and internal, had been silenced, and his grip on the land tightened even further. Yet, as the protagonist sat in the camp that evening cleaning his sword, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The victory was theirs, but the cost of it was growing clearer with each passing day. He had fought for Oda, for Nobunaga, and for a unified Japan. But at what cost? He had seen what loyalty meant now. It was not a noble bond, but a fragile thread easily severed by suspicion, fear, and power. His fellow samurai walked past him, their faces hard and unreadable. They were loyal. But were they truly free? Or had they too become just pawns in a game where only power mattered? A few hours later, the protagonist overheard a quiet conversation between two younger soldiers near the campfire. They spoke in hushed tones, but the words were unmistakable. "How much longer do we follow him?" one asked. "We don't have a choice," the other replied. "If we don't follow, we die." The protagonist's heart sank. These were the voices of the next generation of samurai young men who had once looked to Nobunaga as a hero, as a unifier, but now saw him only as a tyrant. They feared him. They followed him not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. In the days that followed, as Nobunaga's forces continued their conquests, the protagonist felt the weight of his own question growing heavier. What is loyalty when it is demanded by fear? What is power when it is built on betrayal? He had stood at the forefront of many battles, but this one felt different. He was no longer fighting for a noble cause, no longer fighting to unite Japan under a banner of honor. He was fighting for a man whose ambition was devouring everything in its path, his comrades, his allies, and his very soul. As he sat alone in his tent that evening, the protagonist's thoughts turned to his own future. How long would he continue to follow Nobunaga? Was his loyalty worth the price of his humanity? Was it even loyalty anymore? Or had it become something darker, something driven by fear? The price of loyalty is high. The protagonist thought bitterly, staring at his reflection in the polished blade of his sword. But the price of power is even higher. The road to unification was paved with the corpses of the fallen, and as Nobunaga's forces marched forward, the protagonist felt the weight of it pressing down on him more than ever. The lands that had once been rich in culture and tradition were now reduced to ashes villages, decimated in the wake of Oda's conquests. What began as a crusade to unite the fractured country had become a relentless expansion of power, and the path to victory seemed increasingly barren and unforgiving. The protagonist watched the procession of soldiers as they moved through another conquered town, the people of the village either fleeing or hiding in fear. His sword was stained with the blood of his enemies. But as he stood amidst the devastation, the feeling of triumph he had once known was gone. It was replaced by something darker, something that whispered in the silence after battle. The land was scarred, the faces of the villagers etched with the fear of men who had nothing left to give. Nobunaga had gained control of more territory, but his reach was stretching thin. His enemies' rivals, who had once been his allies, had begun to see the true nature of his ambition. With each victory, he alienated more potential allies, forcing them into submission or destroying them outright. Nobunaga's thirst for power was insatiable, and those who once saw him as a liberator now saw him as a tyrant. The protagonist had watched as other warlords, some of whom had helped Nobunaga in earlier campaigns, began to quietly pull away, forming secret alliances in defiance of Oda's growing dominance. How long can this last? The protagonist asked himself as he watched another city fall under Nobunaga's iron grip. How long until there's no one left to trust? The enemy was no longer just outside their gates. It was growing within their own ranks. The warlords who had once respected Nobunaga were now quietly plotting against him, and some of his own generals were beginning to question his leadership. Their loyalty, once fierce and unwavering, had begun to fray at the edges. The protagonist saw it in their eyes, in the whispered conversations between comrades and the tension that filled the air when Nobunaga's name was mentioned. He had been a part of Nobunaga's rise, following him through battle after battle, believing in the cause, in the dream of a unified Japan. But now, he saw how that dream was being corrupted. The people he had fought, beside those who had once shared his ideals of honor and duty, were now pawns in a game of power. The samurai, once revered as protectors of the land, had become tools in the hands of a man whose hunger for power knew no bounds. On one of their campaigns, as Oda's forces continued to push deeper into rival territories, the protagonist came across a scene that would haunt him for weeks to come. They had captured a group of prisoners, enemy soldiers from a defeated clan. As they knelt in the dirt, shackled and bleeding, Nobunaga ordered their immediate execution. No trial, no mercy. Just swift, brutal justice carried out on the spot. We need to show them what happens when they defy me. Nobunaga had said, his voice cold as he stood over the prisoners. The protagonist had stood there, sword in hand, watching the men fall, one by one, their lives snuffed out with a single swing of the blade. It was an efficient act of violence, but it left him empty. The men he had just killed had been soldiers no different from him. They had fought for their lord, believing in the cause they served. Were they any less human than him? Did their lives mean so little? As he wiped the blood from his sword, the protagonist felt a sickness rise in his chest. He was no longer sure who the enemy truly was. Was it the men he fought against? Or was it the very ambition that fueled the war? The ambition that turned men into monsters? Days later, as they rode into yet another town, the protagonist overheard a conversation between two soldiers, their voices low and laden with fear. Did you hear? A new alliance is forming. The Takeda and Wasugi clans are joining forces to challenge Nobunaga. The protagonist's heart sank. Nobunaga's thirst for power had not only alienated former allies, it had now turned the entirety of Japan against him. The warlords who had once been driven by their own ambitions were now uniting against a common enemy. The man who had become too powerful to ignore, and yet, even in the face of this new threat, Nobunaga showed no signs of slowing down. His paranoia and distrust had only deepened. His need for control, for dominance, had grown insatiable. As he looked out across the camp that night, the protagonist felt a sense of unease gnaw at him. The men who once fought for glory, for honor, were now fighting for survival. They had become tools following a warlord who saw them not as comrades, but as instruments of war. The very ideals that had once driven him, the notion that samurai were noble warriors, protectors of the land and its people, had been swept away in the tide of ambition. The protagonist's reflection on the cost of Nobunaga's rise to power grew ever more profound. The land was torn, the people broken, and the samurai code, honor, duty, and loyalty seemed increasingly hollow in a world dominated by war. He had followed Nobunaga with unwavering loyalty, but as he observed the devastation caused by their conquests, he couldn't help but question everything he had once believed. What had they truly fought for? A unified Japan, or the unchecked power of a single man? Was the blood they spilled worth the dream they had once shared? Loyalty, the protagonist thought bitterly. What does it mean now? What is loyalty to a man who would sacrifice everything, including honor, to secure his rule? In the midst of the rising power of Oda, the protagonist was beginning to see the true cost of war, the erosion of ideals, the sacrifice of humanity for the sake of dominance. And in that moment, the meaning of honor seemed more distant than ever. The protagonist had always believed in the samurai code, in the noble pursuit of justice, but now, standing on the precipice of Oda's conquest, he could no longer ignore the truth. The samurai were no longer warriors of honor. They had become soldiers of power pawns in a game they no longer understood, and the price of that loyalty, of that power, was becoming clearer with each passing day. The night air was thick with the weight of uncertainty as the protagonist stood alone, gazing out over the battlefield. The fires of the previous day's victory still smoldered in the distance, casting long, flickering shadows across the land. It was another conquest for Oda Nobunaga, another battle won, another enemy vanquished. But the victory felt as hollow as the others. The protagonist could hear the sounds of celebration in the camp behind him, but he was far removed from it. The cheers, the cries of triumph only served to remind him of what had been lost. For years, he had followed Nobunaga's rise to power with unwavering loyalty, believing that the unification of Japan would bring peace, that the bloodshed was a necessary sacrifice for a brighter future. But now, standing on the precipice of victory, that belief felt distant. Japan was slowly being united under Nobunaga's rule, yet the cost of that unity, of that power, was the very blood of the people, of the land itself. Is this really what we fought for? The protagonist asked himself, his voice barely a whisper against the silence of the night. A country forged in blood and war, where the only winners are those with the power to destroy everything else. The Oda forces had broken through yet another rival stronghold, and Nobunaga's grip on Japan tightened with each passing day. His ambition was relentless, his strategies brilliant in their ruthlessness. The land that had once been divided among warlords was now falling into the hands of a single man. But as the protagonist watched Nobunaga's rise, he began to wonder whether the price of that rise was worth the endless cycle of bloodshed, suffering, and betrayal. The protagonist's journey had been marked by countless battles, too many to count, too many lives lost to remember. Each victory had come at a cost, not just to the enemy, but to him. Atsushi had been the first, a comrade he had fought beside in the early days of their campaign. Now reduced to a lifeless body, cast aside for the sake of political expediency. Katsuya had followed another victim of Nobunaga's suspicion and fear. The protagonist had stood by as these men, his brothers in arms, were discarded like expendable tools sacrificed in the name of consolidation and power. And the losses were not just on the battlefield. The protagonist had seen the toll this war had taken on the people villagers who had been caught between rival factions, torn from their homes, their families shattered in the wake of Nobunaga's unrelenting march. The samurai, once warriors of honor, had become little more than pawns in a game of dominance, moving where their lord commanded, cutting down those who stood in his way without question. The ideals that had once guided him, honor, loyalty, justice, had been twisted, turned into mere tools to further Nobunaga's ambitions. Have we become nothing more than killers? The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of marching feet, the steady rhythm of soldiers moving across the earth. The Oda army, fresh from victory, was already preparing for the next campaign. The cycle of violence would never end. Not until there was nothing left to conquer, nothing left to destroy. He could see it now, clearer than ever. Even as Japan moved toward unification, the bloodshed would continue. Nobunaga's ambitions would not be satisfied by a single conquest. The thirst for power, once unleashed, could never be quenched. The world they fought to create, to unify, was built on a foundation of death. And no matter who stood at the top, whether it was Nobunaga or another, there would always be another enemy to defeat, another victory, to claim another life to take. The protagonist's gaze shifted to the distant horizon where the sun was beginning to rise, casting a new light across the world. It was the dawn of a new era, but the protagonist could no longer see it as a hopeful beginning. To him, it was just another cycle, another dawn that would rise only to be soaked in blood before it set. Is this the path to peace? He thought, the weight of the question pressing down on him. Or is this just another battle in an endless war where the samurai, like pawns, are sacrificed to the whims of those who seek power? He had fought for this. He had bled for it. But as the days wore on, the protagonist began to realize that the samurai were no longer warriors. They were tools, instruments of war, used by those with the ambition to take everything. We fight not for honor anymore, he thought bitterly. We fight for the survival of the one who controls us. That night, as the protagonist lay in his tent, the weight of everything he had seen and done settled on him like a cloak of stone. The faces of the men he had killed, their pleas for mercy, their final moments haunted him in the darkness. He had once believed in the code of the samurai, in the nobility of their cause. But now, as he lay awake, he saw that all of it, the honor, the duty, the loyalty, had been corrupted. The samurai had been nothing more than pawns in a game of power, and the price of that power had been paid in blood. Is this the future we've built? The protagonist wondered. A country united by destruction, where the only loyalty is to the bloodshed that sustains it. As he closed his eyes, the protagonist felt the weight of the realization settle over him. Nobunaga's rise was unstoppable. Yes, but at what cost? The endless war, the sacrifice of countless lives, the corruption of honor. These were the true prices of loyalty in Nobunaga's world. And with each new victory, the protagonist could feel his soul slipping further away. The samurai were no longer warriors of honor. They were just tools in the hands of a man whose thirst for power could never be quenched. And as the sun rose on another day of conquest, the protagonist knew deep down that the cycle of blood would never truly end, not as long as men like Nobunaga sought to claim it all. The fires of conquest may have burned brightly, but as the smoke cleared and the dust settled, the true cost of the war was evident. Nobunaga's victory was undeniable. He had brought the land to its knees and unified Japan under his iron grip. But at what cost? The bloodshed had been unimaginable, and the lives lost were countless. The protagonist could not escape the faces of the fallen, the comrades he had fought alongside the enemies he had once respected, all sacrificed in the name of power. The land that had been torn apart by feudal wars was now left to pick up the pieces. But even in the wake of Nobunaga's unification, there was a pervasive sense of emptiness. The people who had once been free, who had lived their lives under different banners and different lords, now had only one choice: to serve under Oda. The samurai, once noble defenders of honor, had become pawns in the grand game of power. What had they truly fought for? A unified Japan, or the ambition of a single man? The legacy of the war was not just in the land that had been brought together, but in the broken hearts and shattered lives left behind. For the protagonist, the victory was bitter. The ideals of loyalty, honor, and duty that had once burned brightly now felt like ghosts fading into the past. The samurai code, once revered, had become a tool used to justify the brutal choices made in the name of conquest. As Japan stood at the brink of a new era, the protagonist understood something that would forever shape his soul. The cost of power was steep, and the consequences of war would echo for generations. The men who fought those who survived would carry the weight of that cost for the rest of their lives, haunted by the blood spilled and the lives destroyed. And so, as the world continued to turn, the protagonist found himself lying under a quiet sky, the weight of his journey still heavy on his heart. The battles were over for now, but the echoes of war would live on, carried in the hearts of those who had fought for better or worse. In the stillness of the night, surrounded by the soft sounds of nature, the protagonist allowed himself a rare moment of peace. As the journey of battle and ambition winds down, we are left with the echoes of what has come before: the cost of loyalty, the weight of power, and the toll of war. No matter where you are or what battles you're facing, remember that peace is often hard won, and victory comes at a price. So as we close the pages of this story, may you find a moment of quiet reflection, just as the protagonist did in the midst of it all. Rest easy tonight, knowing that tomorrow brings a new chance for peace, for growth, and for understanding. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the courage to face the battles ahead.